So another critic of the diet hard hypothesis, and how was he treated? This is Stefansson, a Harvard anthropologist who went up and lived with the Inuit in Alaska. He found that they ate for 6 to 9 months nothing but caribou, followed by exclusively salmon and a month of eggs in the spring. 70 to 80% of their calories in their diet came from fat. And it was clear that they were extremely healthy. He said that the fat deposits behind the caribou eye and along the jaw were the most prized, followed by the rest of the head, the heart, and the kidneys, and the leaner parts, including the tenderloin, were fed to the dogs. He talks about going home, when he goes home, and how easy it is. He gets to get all the fatty meat from his butcher for free because nobody wants it but him. He said the chief occasion for vegetables with the Eskimo was famine. And again, he found them to be extremely healthy, and he published all of these observations in a best-selling book. I'll also just tell you this story. He came home, and of course, nobody believed anything that he said about the Inuit, and so he and a colleague checked themselves into Bellevue Hospital in 1928 for a year, and ate nothing but meat and fat for an entire year, to a chorus of protests of people believing that they would most certainly die. And they did this for a year. Several months were under strict supervision, and then they were allowed to be out and about. They both lost weight. They both were in perfect health. And at the end of that, they published 6 papers by medical experts who had been following every aspect of their physical health, and they could find nothing wrong with them. And all of those were published, and all of those were ignored. And he also experienced being confronted by Ancel Keys. Well, here he was. He had his hypothesis, or what he had observed was that a high-fat diet was completely healthy. And I want to say here, it's important to say it's not that I personally recommend a diet of only meat and fat, or that I eat a diet of meat and fat only, but it's just important to note that these are scientific observations that are being made. And in this case, Ancel Keys's response, instead of being interested in Stefansson's work, he certainly knew about it, which was to diminish Stefansson's work and say, to sort of belittle it, saying the bizarre manner of life excites the imagination, the popular picture of the Eskimo happily gorging on blubber, but it is no grounds to suggest that it has anything to do with our diet fat coronary hypothesis. One other example of ignoring data to the contrary, another just sort of powerful example, is a study by, and this is in my book on pages 54 and 55, S.L. Malhotra, Chief Medical Officer of the Western Railway Company of Bombay. He studied 1 million male employees of the Indian Railways in the mid-1960s. During a 5-year period, he found that the rate of heart disease among railroad sweepers in Madras, southern India, was 7 times higher than the rate for the Punjabi railroad sweepers in the north. Yet the Punjabis ate 8 to 19 times more fat, mostly from dairy products. The Southerners ate very little fat, and what they did eat was from unsaturated ground nut oil. The Southerners, on that low-fat ground nut oil diet, also died, on average, 12 years earlier than their northern counterparts. Remember, this is a study on 1 million people. So Malhotra concluded that in his paper with the suggestion that maybe we should be eating more fermented milk products such as yogurt, sherbet, and butter. And he published his findings in one of the most important journals in the field of epidemiology, but no one commented upon his work, and it has almost never been cited. So I give you all these examples. One other one, which is this study in Roseto, Pennsylvania, a little bit closer to home, where mostly Italian population was found to have strikingly low number of deaths from heart disease, less than half the rate of neighboring towns. They were Italian immigrants, but they ate copious amount of animal fats, including prosciutto with an inch thick fat rim around the prosciutto they ate. Most meals were cooked in lard, and they ate large meals and drank a great deal of wine. And they were also generally overweight, but not a single one under 50 died of a heart attack in the years, the 6 years that they were studied. And that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1964, also a very prominent journal. And Keyes published a 3-page reply, which is, extraordinarily long. I mean, normally your letter to an editor you get to publish, just like a few hundred words. And here's Keyes publishing a 3-page reply, which just shows you what a favored scientist he was inside this community. And he was effectively able to marginalize the Rosetto, Pennsylvania study, even though it was a well-done study. So this is what's been called, these are all called what I call, I'm not the first one to call it, but they've been called silent studies. Studies that are done, but they're never cited. They're not in review papers. Nobody talks about them. They just drop out of the literature. They just sort of disappear because people don't want to reckon with them. And again, I mention them because it's important to note that all of these were observations that Keyes' hypothesis could not explain. In science, when you have a hypothesis, the fundamental rule is your hypothesis has to be able to explain the observations. What is it you see? Can your hypothesis explain that? If it cannot, if there's an observation that you cannot explain, such as healthy Maasai warriors eating nothing but meat and fat and blood, then you have to reconsider your hypothesis. That's the way science progresses. And instead, Keyes' response was to suppress those observations or ignore them or silence them. That's not just Keyes, but the whole community. And to try to diminish them by calling the authors names or diminishing the quality of work or saying it was full of errors or diminishing it as exotic or something strange or bizarre. And I think that we see this still today in the treatment of Professor Noakes, which is, here's a number of observations associated with the work of Professor Noakes. You can't walk down half a block with Professor Noakes without somebody saying, 20 kilograms, Professor, 15 kilograms, people who've lost weight on his diet. And there's a whole body of clinical trial research that I will show later that supports that diet. What has been the response? This is the same response: to deny it, to make fun of him, to pretend his work is full of errors, instead of reckoning with it and saying, okay, here are a number of observations our current hypothesis does not explain. We need to explain it. That's what science does. Good science does. But I suggest that it's not what happens in the field of nutrition science because of the way that nutrition science was formed so much by this particular attitude and personality of Ancel Keys. I want to just talk about what I think is the most extraordinary example of silencing data, which is the Minnesota Coronary Survey, at least the most extraordinary example that I have ever come across. This is one of those randomized controlled trials that both Dr. Harcombe and I have discussed. It was the largest ever test of Ancel Keys' hypothesis on 9,000 men and women. It went on for 4.5 years. It swapped out saturated fat for unsaturated fat. And at the end of that, it was an inpatient setting in mental hospitals, and so it was a well-controlled trial. At the end of that, they could find no difference between the treatment and the control groups in terms of their cardiovascular events or cardiovascular deaths. So Ivan Franz, who is one of the project leaders on that study, he and Ancel Keys was another. They sat on their study results for 16 years and did not publish them. And when they did publish them, they put it in this little out-of-the-way journal known as ATVB, which they knew nobody would ever read. And when Dr. France was asked much later by a journalist, why did you not publish your results? He replied, well, there was nothing wrong with the study. We were just so disappointed in the way it came out. Which, as Dr. Mann notes, is a form of scientific fraud. And that study was just last year unearthed again, and new data from the study was found. It was published, republished in the British Medical Journal, And they found in the new data that had been discovered that there was actually a higher risk of death associated with each degree of lowering of serum cholesterol. So I want to shift here and just talk about, well, what is the influence of industry in all of this? And we know the food industry is large and powerful and plays a role in our nutrition policy. So I want to just talk a little bit about that. I talked to hundreds of executives and came to realize, how profoundly the food industry affects science. They do this most cleverly, and they discovered this early on. So the very first group that was formed to try to influence nutrition was in 1941. The Nutrition Foundation was formed, and it was put together by huge food companies. So this is the birth of large food manufacturing. So General Foods, Quaker Oats, Heinz, the National Biscuit Company, Corn Products Refining Corporation. And they started this was before even the NIH was funded. So they started financing science, nutrition science, and they understood that the most effective way to influence policy is to fund science at its very source. You fund scientists, you fund university chairs. You don't wait until the studies are done and try to influence at the level of going to Washington, although they do that too. But the cleverest way to influence science is to do it at its source with the scientists themselves. And of course, they had an interest in the diet-hard hypothesis, because what are the diet-hard hypothesis? Who benefited from the diet-hard hypothesis? Two major groups. If you lower fat, you increase carbohydrates. So all the carbohydrate companies who produce cookies, crackers, chips, cereals, grains, rice, all those companies benefit from a reduction in fat. And the other thing that happens, if you reduce saturated fats, butter, lard, you increase unsaturated fats. So I'll just tell you a little story about how the vegetable oil industry influenced all of this. So Procter & Gamble, which is the maker of Crisco oil, one of the early makers of vegetable oil in the United States, they figured out that it would be helpful for them to be influential in the American Heart Association. So in the 1940s, the American Heart Association was still this sleepy little society of cardiologists. Remember, heart disease was still a relatively new disease, so they were not well organized, and they didn't have many funds. And then in 1948, Procter & Gamble offered to make them the designee of a radio contest, and it was called the Walking Men Contest. And literally overnight, according to their own company history, millions of dollars flowed into their coffers, and they were transformed into, they started opening chapters all over the United States and transformed into the powerhouse that they are today. They are still the #1 largest nonprofit in the United States, still funded by Procter & Gamble. This is all from their official company history. That the P&G from check from Procter & Gamble was the bang of big bucks that launched the group. And they opened 7 chapters and collected another more than $2.5 million in donations. And Fred Kummerow, a biochemist who was then on one of the nutrition committees at the American Heart Association, who's now, I think, 102, and still calls me all the time. He says, "Nina, why can't I get my studies funded?" I'm like, "Because you're 102. He wrote a letter to the American Heart Association, which I have, chastising the then medical director of the American Heart Association, saying, who had apparently posed with a bottle of Crisco oil in an educational film, saying, and Kummerow says, "This is rank commercialism." But the influence of the vegetable oil industry really just cannot be overestimated. I mean, Jeremiah Stamler, who was very closely tied with Ancel Keys and all the work they did. He was a Chicago doctor. This is a professional courtesy version of his book, that is sponsored by the corn products refining company, and inside he thanks both that company and the Wesson Oil Fund for Medical Research, for which he received significant research supports. And when I interviewed him, and I said, well, how do you justify being supported by the vegetable oil industry when that is your recommendation to tell people to eat more vegetable oils? He said, well, you just have to form alliances with industry. It's, it's dirty, but he didn't use the word dirty. He said, but it's just necessary in this line of work. And one of the brilliant things about the way that the vegetable oil companies promoted themselves is that they made themselves out to be health foods. This is, these are ads, take this ad to your doctor. But they were seen as, use oils to lower your cholesterol. This was a marketing point for them. That ad about with the child there, actually our Federal Trade Commission in 1974 insisted that they remove that ad because there was no evidence for children. And this is just another example of how this was an ad in a magazine showing Wesson Oil advertising itself as like a pharmaceutical. Have Wesson Oil to help avoid heart attacks. Another example of how vegetable oil company, the vegetable oil scientists really were, they were part of that inner circle, designing studies. They were appointed to NIH panels, and they donated all of their products for all those big randomized controlled clinical trials that we talked about. All those products, the soy-filled cheese, the soy-filled milk, the soy burgers, all of that was coming from these companies that made those products. So you could see, in some ways, those large NIH-funded clinical trials were, an effort by these industries to expand their market and use the scientific community as a way of validating their products.
From your research, what can you tell Madam Chair about the industry and their influence, if any, on policy in respect of nutrition and the guidelines?
I want to talk about that in two ways. One is that the American Heart Association and the National Institutes of Health are almost like twin agencies that grew up together. They were the same. They were launched in the same year. They jointly held conferences, all the major conferences on heart disease they held together. They had kind of interlocking panels. The same people would serve on the American Heart Association and would serve on the NIH panels, and particularly the ones having to do with heart disease. So they were very closely interlinked, and that is still true today. And what you see is this term that was coined actually by another journalist called the nutrition aristocrats, which is that there's a small group of scientists who really control the agenda in science. So seated in front, your left is Ansel Keys, in the middle is Jeremiah Stamler, and behind him is Henry Blackburn, a few names that I've already mentioned. This is, the core group. They were really in charge. They were the ones who sat on the editorial boards of the medical journals. They were the ones who sat on the panels that decided how the NIH, who got grants for funding, and then they would receive the funds and do the studies, and then they would review each other's papers and publish them in their journals, and they would sit on all the expert panels, and they really kind of controlled the agenda. And those critics that I've been talking about were if you criticized them, you were excluded. And this is still true today. There are many more women now in this inner circle group, but it is still true that a small group around these associations, NIH and the American Heart Association, control nutrition policy.
Ms. Teicholz, you spoke of these nutrition aristocrats. From your research, what have you found in respect of whether the nutrition aristocrats influence policy?
Yeah, I think it's just really important to take a brief moment to discuss how all this science then became our dietary guidelines. right? Because what we're talking about here is the conventional advice. The conventional advice is most powerfully enshrined in the US Dietary Guidelines. So I just want to tell you briefly how those came about. They came about in the late 1970s, where the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition, headed by McGovern, Senator McGovern, they had a series of hearings about the so-called killer diseases, which were heart disease, and then there was also cancer was on the rise, and it was more of a threat than it had been previously. And they had a series of meetings, and then they wrote up a report that became the foundation of the Dietary Guidelines. So how was that report written? That's the critical thing. How was the science evaluated? I think somebody had a question about that yesterday. Well, it turns out it was written by one committee staffer. Committees in Congress are the people on them are lawyers and ex-journalists. This was a committee staffer who had a past. His name was Nick Mattern. He had worked as a labor reporter and a progressive. He wrote up the entire report in a month. So when I talk about my 10 years of research in nutrition science, he would manage to do that in a month. And he had no background in nutrition. He didn't know anything. He was in no position to understand questions about, sample sizes or the pitfalls of epidemiology or any of those things. And he also didn't know to ask for a variety of opinions. So he was steered almost entirely in his work, and this is documented in the book Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes, that he was guided by Mark Hegsted, who was a diet heart stalwart from Harvard, and other advisors included only people from the American Heart Association. And Mattern was an interesting, he was a progressive and a liberal, and he saw big meat like big tobacco. So it's kind of just an interesting anthropological note on this. At that time, there had been all the scandals of big tobacco, and McGovern is from a cattle raising state, and so Mattern would see all these cattlemen swaggering through the office to go meet with McGovern, and he assumed they were doing the same thing that big tobacco did, which is to try to cover up the ill effects of their harmful product. That was he was a vegetarian. So, he didn't know about all the other companies that were influencing science behind the scenes. He just saw what he saw. So he wrote up the report, and his recommendation was in line with what the AHA was recommending, which was the Americans should eat between 30 to 40% fat and 55 to 60% of their calories as carbohydrates, and saturated fat was capped at 10%. I think Dr. Harcombe mentioned yesterday, but I will again here, that there's a number of senators who were very skeptical of this report. Charles Percy from Illinois wrote that he had serious reservations about the fact that there was divergence of scientific opinion on whether the dietary change can help. But the Senate report said, and this is a theme that is echoed over and over again, we cannot afford to wait for the ultimate proof before correcting trends we believe to be detrimental. So we cannot, it's the same thing that Pete Aaron said when he urged caution, and the response was, we cannot afford to wait. We cannot afford to wait for all the science to come in. We must act now. And so it was that the Dietary Goals, compiled by one interested layperson, Nick Mattern, without any formal review, became arguably the most influential document in the history of diet and disease.